A single quiet decision can echo through generations like a soft pulse in the fabric of time. Sometimes revolutions are not shouted. They are whispered through an act of refusal. Good evening. Wherever you are listening from, on a quiet night, an early morning, or perhaps on a train that hums gently beneath the stars, you are part of a shared memory. This is Biography Files Docs, where we walk through the lives of those who shaped history, not with thunder, but with stillness. If this journey speaks to you, I invite you to join our growing circle by subscribing, and perhaps leaving a small note about where and when you're listening tonight. The story we step into is not a story of grandeur. It is a story born in quiet rooms, in long fields, on uneven roads. It is a story that began with a child watching trains fade into the horizon, dreaming of a life where dignity was not rationed out in narrow spaces. This is the story of Rosa Parks. The soil of Alabama in the early 20th century held the weight of centuries, not only in the heat of its sun-baked earth or the scent of pine trees whispering above winding paths, but in its history, its silence, its division. When Rosa was born in 1913, the landscape around her carried the shadows of a reconstruction that had promised much and delivered little. Segregation was not just a system, it was the air. It wrapped itself around schools, workplaces, churches, the way light falls unevenly through a broken window. She came into a world where to be black was to be measured, to be watched, to be contained. Yet in that same world, families built quiet fortresses around kitchen tables. Her grandparents' home in Pine Level was one of those places. It was not a mansion, nor a place that would be mapped in history books, but it was a place where love was held like a shield, where pride was not shouted, but lived. Her grandfather, a man who had once been enslaved, walked with the weight of memory in his spine. He was not loud, but his presence filled the house. He would stand on the porch at night, holding his rifle, not as a threat, but as a silent warning to the night riders who sometimes passed down the road. To a young girl, this was not just protection. It was a language, a lesson that dignity is not given, it is guarded. Her grandmother, with hands worn by years of labor, taught Rosa about worth. She spoke softly, often in rhythms that sounded like prayers. And those prayers were not of meek surrender, but of quiet endurance. They tended their small plot of land, raised livestock, grew vegetables. Everything they built was with hands that the world refused to see as equal. The house itself was built of wood that creaked in the wind. It smelled of smoke from the iron stove, of earth after rain, of fabric dried under a southern sun. In the evenings, fireflies would scatter themselves across the fields like tiny floating embers, and Rosa would sit on the steps, listening to the grown-ups speak in low, serious tones about what it meant to survive in a world that kept trying to make them disappear. In those years, her world was measured in small journeys, down dusty roads to church, through fields to help with chores, across creeks where children laughed in brief moments of unguarded joy. She didn't yet have the words for injustice, but she saw it. She saw it when her grandfather's jaw tightened at the sound of a car passing slowly at night. She saw it in the way her elders spoke of their neighbors who had disappeared, of the weight that seemed to hang in the air when the sun went down. The early 1900s in Alabama were not kind years. The promise of freedom after the Civil War had long faded, replaced by Jim Crow laws that built invisible cages around every black family. Schooling was scarce. Resources were divided not by chance, but by design. Yet even in these harsh spaces, the black community built a kind of quiet brilliance. Schools and churches, songs sung in fields, sermons that carried hope as if it were a living thing. Rosa's early education came as much from her elders as from any teacher. She learned to read the Bible, to recite verses, to sew, to hold her chin high even when others tried to lower it. Pride was not arrogance, it was survival, and dignity in those years was a quiet rebellion. There were nights when she lay awake on a narrow bed, listening to the sound of the train tracks not far from their home. The trains would pass in the darkness, their whistles long and low, cutting through the southern night. She imagined where they were going, north perhaps, to places she'd only heard about in fragments, cities where people moved without stepping off sidewalks to let others pass. She didn't yet know the shape of those cities, but she knew the sound of leaving. There was something in those train whistles, a note between longing and promise, that settled deep in her chest. She didn't yet know what her life would become. She only knew that the world was larger than these fields, and that one day, somehow, she might step into it not as someone who must move aside, but as someone who stands. She was a child, but even then, she carried the weight of history without fully naming it. History, in her world, was not written in books. It was folded into the way her grandfather locked the door at night. It was in the firm grip of her grandmother's hand as they walked to church. It was in the quiet, the kind that is not silence but preparation. And somewhere in the distance, a train whistle rose and fell again, disappearing into the dark trees. The whistle of the train lingers as if suspended in the humid night air, a thin, mournful thread connecting one day to the next. Rosa's small feet press into the packed dirt of the path home from school, a path she walks every day, dusty in summer, slick with red clay after rain. She is no stranger to the long miles. There is no bus waiting for children who look like her. The buses rumble by carrying white children, their faces pressed to the windows with the casualness of those who do not know they are privileged. Rosa walks on, her books against her chest, the sun laying its warm hands on her shoulders. She does not complain. She observes. She carries. The road becomes a classroom in its own right, teaching her about what the world chooses to give and what it chooses to withhold. The school she attends is small and underfunded, a single building with uneven floors and books already worn down from other hands. But it is also a place where young minds are shaped into quiet, determined forces. The teachers are not paid much. Many walk long distances just as their students do, yet they bring a kind of fierce belief that education is a weapon no law can confiscate. Rosa listens carefully in those classes, not just because she wants to learn, but because she understands, even as a child, that knowledge is a fragile, powerful thing in a place where others work so hard to keep it out of reach. It is in those years that Rosa begins to see clearly the carefully constructed lines of separation, signs on water fountains, the arrangement of seats in buses, the schools with better books and buildings set aside for white children, the constant message that her existence should be quiet, obedient, and peripheral. She watches it with the eyes of someone both too young to resist and already old enough to understand. When she walks into town with her grandmother, she notices how the sidewalks themselves seem to bend around rules, how black men and women step aside to let white people pass, how even looking too long can be considered dangerous. Rosa is small, but inside she is already collecting moments. They settle deep inside her like stones on the bed of a river, each one heavy, silent, undeniable. A shopkeeper's dismissive glance, a policeman's tone, the sting of overheard words she is told not to repeat. They do not break her, but they shape the quiet space inside where resistance will one day take root. Her grandparents, aware of the dangers that surround their family, walk the delicate balance of protection and truth. They do not fill her head with false comforts. Instead, they teach her the language of survival. They teach her when to look down and when to stand still. They teach her to read not only the words in her school books, but the meanings in other people's eyes. And above all, they teach her that beneath the imposed humiliation, there is an unbroken dignity no one can take. Every morning before walking to school, Rosa brushes the dust from her shoes as if preparing for something important. In a way, she is. The path to learning is not merely about letters and numbers. It is a daily act of defiance, a quiet rejection of the boundaries drawn around her. She knows the buses will pass again, their engines growling, their passengers glancing out, and she knows she will keep walking. Each step is not just a movement forward. It is a quiet, steady claim to space in a world that has denied her so much of it. Her teachers speak often about history, not the history found in the textbooks where Black lives are confined to a few lines, but the history carried in their own voices. They speak of ancestors who built, who resisted, who endured. Rosa listens, and the images form inside her, not as abstract lessons, but as living presences. She begins to imagine them walking beside her on the long road home, their footsteps mingling with hers. In those moments, she is not just a child walking alone. She is part of a much larger story, one written beneath the surface of the official one. Sometimes, on days when the sun is high and the air smells of warm pine and dust, Rosa lifts her eyes to the sky and wonders about the people on those trains she hears at night. She wonders if they are free. She wonders if they ever feel the weight of a world trying to push them down. And then she wonders, though she does not yet have the language for it, if a person can be small and still resist, if defiance can exist without noise, if a quiet walk along a long road can be the beginning of something larger. She does not yet imagine the history books. She does not imagine speeches or marches or honors. What she knows now is this: there are people who take up all the space, and there are people forced to make their lives in the shadows. But shadows are not empty. They are places where strength is forged, where silence becomes steel. When Rosa reaches home in the late afternoon, the train whistle sounds again in the distance. She stands for a moment, books in hand, the warm wind brushing her face. The sun is setting low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the fields. She watches those shadows stretch, and she knows in some quiet, wordless way that they will not last forever. The sound of that distant whistle fades slowly, leaving only the quiet hum of evening cicadas and the muted rhythm of footsteps in a city that has drawn its lines with an almost ceremonial precision. Montgomery, in Rosa's teenage years, is not merely a place on a map. It is a living structure of boundaries. Its streets are mapped with invisible rules, its benches carved not only of wood, but of expectation, its air heavy with instructions about where one may sit, where one may drink, where one may simply exist. These are not rules that need to be shouted. They hang unspoken, understood by all, enforced by looks, gestures, and the steady weight of threat. Rosa is now tall enough to see these lines clearly. She walks with a new awareness, no longer the child who wonders in silence, but the young woman who observes with a keen, quiet intelligence. The city is divided not just physically, but in its very pulse. There are neighborhoods of privilege, with well-paved roads and broad porches, and neighborhoods where every crack in the sidewalk tells a story of neglect, carefully maintained. Buses move through these streets like small floating barriers, carrying bodies in separate sections, sealing the illusion that this division is natural. But Rosa has learned enough to know it is not. She walks through the city with her grandmother, careful with her steps. White pedestrians approach on the sidewalk and the ritual repeats, stepping aside, looking down, moving around rather than through. It is a performance learned over generations, one meant to protect life. Yet as Rosa obeys it, outwardly, inside something quiet begins to resist. A thought, unshaped but persistent, that dignity should not be something rationed out depending on who passes first on a walkway. She does not speak it aloud. Words like that could be dangerous, but silence does not mean absence. It means growth in hidden soil. In the segregated schools, Rosa sits on benches worn down by the weight of children who came before her. Books arrive used, their covers marked with other names, their pages smudged with other hands. Yet these classrooms are spaces of astonishing determination. Teachers stand before their students not only to teach arithmetic or spelling, but to remind them, gently but firmly, that their worth does not end where society's laws say it should. They teach them how to think beyond their surroundings, how to imagine a life larger than the fenced-in lots they return to each evening. For Rosa, this becomes more than learning. It becomes breathing. She feels the double weight of adolescence and injustice pressing together. On some days, she carries it like an invisible coat, heavy on her shoulders but not seen by others. On other days, it becomes a sharpness inside her, a steady hum of quiet anger that she cannot yet give shape to. She begins to sense that her life will not be contained entirely by the expectations laid out before her. And this is not a feeling of rebellion in the loud, fiery sense. It is something quieter, more enduring, like a small stone wedged deep in the earth, immovable beneath the weight of passing feet. Church remains a place of gathering, of whispered hope. In the pews, Rosa listens to sermons about endurance, about the unshakable worth of the soul, about a justice that exists even when the world insists it does not. But the church is more than faith. It is also a place where eyes meet, where plans are formed quietly, where communities remember that they are not alone. Rosa absorbs this, not only the prayers, but the way people look at each other when they speak of change, the way their voices lower when they talk about what might be possible. Montgomery's buses pass by every day, their doors opening and closing like a rhythm too familiar to question. She watches them, those iron vessels of division, as she walks on the cracked sidewalks. The front seats are for white passengers, the back for black passengers, and in between a shifting line determined not by fairness but by arbitrary enforcement. She sees elderly black women stand so white passengers may sit, sees men who have worked long hours silently obey the order to move back. She sees the small humiliations layered one upon another like thin sheets of dust, nearly invisible to those who do not live inside them. To Rosa, they are anything but invisible. They are weight. They are truth. And yet, in the spaces between these acts, there is also something else, a whisper of refusal that floats through communities like a rumor. Names are spoken softly. People who pushed back, who didn't step aside, who were punished, yes, but who became stories whispered at night. Rosa listens to these whispers the way some children listen to fairy tales. But these stories are not fantasies. They are possibilities. They are reminders that even within a cage, someone can stretch their arms and test the bars. When she walks home at the end of a long day, Rosa looks at the fading sunlight spilling across the streets of Montgomery. She sees the way shadows stretch long and uneven, how they cover both rich and poor, both white and black. The light does not obey the laws that people have drawn. It falls where it will. And though she says nothing, she notices this small rebellion in the way light moves. Perhaps that noticing is where resistance truly begins, not in the moment one acts, but in the moment one quietly refuses to accept the world as unchangeable. The sound of a bus engine fades behind her. A dog barks somewhere down a back alley. The air smells of warm dust and magnolia blossoms. Rosa breathes it in slowly. She does not yet know where this quiet refusal inside her will lead. She only knows it is growing, steady and certain, like roots beneath the surface, unseen but alive. The engine of that bus fades into a softer sound, the rustling of night air through the thin wooden walls of a barber shop, where a door opens and closes with the weight of routine. It is in this space, modest and full of familiar scents, shaving cream, tobacco, the faint trace of cologne, that Rosa first meets Raymond Parks. He is not a man of many words, but the few he chooses carry with them a kind of quiet assurance. He works as a barber, his hands steady, his posture unhurried. There's a calm in him, but beneath that calm, Rosa senses a current, something sharpened by experience, by struggle. Raymond is already involved in activism, though in these times that word is rarely spoken aloud. It is too dangerous, too heavy with consequence. But in the corners of barber shops, in the back rooms of churches, in whispered gatherings over food and old wooden tables, there are conversations that matter. He is part of those conversations. His involvement with the defense of the Scottsboro boys has given him a reputation among some as brave and among others as reckless. But Rosa listens when he speaks. His words do not burn with loud fury. They move with careful precision, like someone who has learned how to speak without drawing the wrong kind of ears. Their courtship unfolds not in a world of luxury, but in a world where every shared look carries layers of meaning. They talk in the evenings about work, about family, about the shape of their lives in a country that has drawn its borders inside their days. Rosa has always been observant, but with Raymond she begins to understand how that observation can become something sharper, something intentional. He introduces her to people who speak more openly about injustice, people who have decided that silence will not keep them safe anyway. She listens with both caution and hunger. Raymond does not try to protect her from the truth. He does not wrap it in easy reassurances. Instead, he respects the strength he already sees in her. Perhaps that is what draws them together. She is not looking for someone to tell her that the world will be kind. She already knows it will not. She is looking for someone who sees her clearly, who understands the weight she carries, who does not turn away from it. Their love is not a dramatic storm. It is quiet, steady, like the slow weaving of two lives around the same unspoken promise. To live with dignity, no matter how many ways the world tries to take it from them. When they walk together through Montgomery, they are careful. A black couple moving through the city must always be aware of how they are seen. Yet there is a sense of shared strength between them, a private understanding in their silences. They marry in 1932, when Rosa is still very young. It is not a wedding of wealth, but of certainty. She steps into that union with both love and the understanding that this man's life, and now her life, will be bound to struggle. She does not shrink from it. Raymond encourages her to finish her education, something she had been forced to leave behind to care for family. In that encouragement, she feels something rare, the belief that her mind matters, that her voice is worth being heard. Their home is simple, a small place where the air carries the scent of meals cooked slowly after long workdays. But it becomes more than a home. It becomes a space where leaflets are folded, where conversations about injustice linger long into the night, where quiet resistance takes shape in the rhythm of everyday life. Rosa sews, Raymond cuts hair, neighbors visit, and in between those ordinary gestures, history is being written in the margins. Not the kind of history that fills textbooks, but the kind that keeps communities alive. On some nights, after everyone else has gone, Rosa and Raymond sit together in the stillness, talking in low voices. He tells her stories about what he's seen, the arrests, the cruelty, the moments where one act of courage felt like a flame in the dark. She listens, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. Outside, the city sleeps in its segregated order. Inside, two people talk not of what is, but of what could be. There is a particular night Rosa will remember later, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because of how the air felt. It was warm, the kind of warmth that holds the smell of cut grass and distant rain. Raymond spoke quietly about the future, not as a dream, but as something that might be forced into existence. Rosa did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him, at the small lamp casting its soft circle of light, at the shadows that stretched along the floorboards. In that silence, something settled between them. Not a plan, not a promise spoken aloud, but a shared understanding that they would face whatever was coming together. And somewhere outside, beyond the edge of the barber shop, beyond the edges of their quiet conversations, the train still passed through Montgomery at night. Rosa still heard their whistles, though now they no longer carried just the sound of faraway places. They carried the echo of choices she had not yet made, of a future waiting patiently in the distance, steady as steel. The night in their small home often carries with it a texture, a kind of layered stillness that isn't empty but alive with whispers, with the shifting weight of shared convictions. In those first years of marriage, Rosa and Raymond build something quiet but unyielding together, a household where conversations about the world outside their walls never really end. Even when the lamps are turned low and the dishes are washed and stacked, the air still holds the residue of unfinished sentences about justice, about fear, about what it means to endure. Their house is modest, a few rooms pressed close together, the floors creaking with each step, but it is also a shelter, not only for themselves, but for others who come through its door. Activists, neighbors, family members seeking refuge from the daily abrasions of segregation. They gather around their table, not in open defiance, but in careful, deliberate connection. There is a discipline to this kind of resistance. It is not made of fiery speeches or grand declarations. It is made of small, consistent acts, folding leaflets on rough wooden surfaces, speaking names that the city wants forgotten, sharing news of those who have been arrested or beaten, planning how to help without drawing too much attention. Rosa moves through these evenings with quiet precision. She listens far more than she speaks. She has learned that there is power in listening, in holding a story long enough to understand the weight it carries. She notices how fear settles in people's shoulders, how hope flickers like a small candle, and how easily it can be blown out. But she also notices something else, the way people keep coming, even when they are tired, even when they are frightened, even when the world tells them again and again that they do not matter. The city outside their door is relentless in its cruelty. There are curfews that are never officially written down, but always enforced. There are laws that humiliate and a culture that reinforces them. Raymond's barber shop often becomes a place where these realities are spoken plainly. Men sit in the chair, the soft buzz of clippers filling the air, and talk about what happened to so-and-so on the corner of this street or that. Whispers travel faster than newspapers. There are no headlines for Black suffering, no pages dedicated to the quiet daily violences that structure their lives. But within these small networks, truth moves like water, finding its way through every gap. Rosa knows the shape of this world intimately. She knows which streets are safe to walk and which are not. She knows how the police look at her neighbors, at any Black person moving through Montgomery. But in the sanctuary of their home, she also feels something else, a sense of belonging, of being part of a current that runs beneath the surface. This current isn't loud, but it is steady. It is a force that does not wait for permission. It is during these years that Rosa's sense of identity deepens. She is no longer just the quiet observer of her childhood. She is a participant now, though in a way that suits her nature. Her activism isn't defined by shouting from pulpits or standing at the front of marches. Not yet. It is defined by sewing a torn hem for a neighbor who is organizing a meeting, by passing along a piece of information in a way that leaves no trail, by offering a space where people can sit and speak without looking over their shoulders every few minutes. There are nights when the air outside grows still and heavy, and the only sound is the distant passing of cars, their headlights sweeping across the thin curtains. On those nights, after the last guest has left and the last pamphlet has been stacked neatly away, Rosa sits at the table with Raymond. They do not need to fill the silence with words. He leans back in his chair, tired but still alert. She traces her fingers along the table's edge, her thoughts moving in quiet, determined lines. They both know that what they are doing, what their entire community is doing, exists under the threat of reprisal. People disappear in this world, not always dramatically. Sometimes it's a sudden arrest. Sometimes it's a lost job. Sometimes it's just the way others stop meeting your eyes when they see you on the street. But fear, like violence, is something they have learned to live beside without letting it rule them completely. Rosa's strength in these years is forged not in sudden bursts, but in the steady, daily insistence on being present. She walks to work. She cares for her family. She opens her door to those who need it. And each of these actions, though ordinary, carries the quiet defiance of someone refusing to vanish. The air thickens in Alabama summers, the nights stretching long and warm. On one of those nights, the smell of magnolia drifts through their open window. Rosa rests her head against the cool wood of the chair and closes her eyes. She hears the hum of distant voices from a neighbor's porch, the call of crickets in the grass, and the familiar sound of Raymond exhaling after a long day. There is nothing grand in this moment, but in its simplicity lies the shape of everything that will come after. The battles that history will one day record begin here, in kitchens and back rooms, in quiet gatherings, where people allow themselves to imagine a world that does not yet exist. Rosa does not know yet how her name will be spoken one day. She does not know that her quiet defiance will ripple far beyond Montgomery, but something inside her has already set its roots. They wind through the wood of this house, through the red soil outside, through the very air she breathes. The lamp on the table flickers. Raymond leans forward to turn it down. Outside, the night holds its breath. Rosa opens her eyes and looks toward the door, as if sensing that history itself is waiting somewhere beyond it, not in a storm, but in a single, ordinary moment that has not yet arrived. The quiet lamplight inside their small house eventually meets the daylight of a different kind of room, the plain, practical space of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People office in Montgomery. There is nothing glamorous about this office. Its walls are scuffed from years of chairs being pushed back and papers being pinned. Its floor creaks, and its air smells faintly of ink and dust and paper that has passed too many hands. Yet here, in this modest place, Rosa takes her place at a desk and begins to do the work that history often overlooks. She is a secretary for the local branch, and that title, though quiet, carries weight. It means she is the keeper of details, the one who listens, who writes, who remembers what others might forget. The meetings held here are not loud, not at first. They are careful, strategic, the product of a movement that has learned to live beneath the scrutiny of those who would rather it not exist at all. Rosa sits with her notebook open, pencil in hand, and listens as men and women speak about discrimination cases, about jobs denied, about beatings, about voting tests designed to exclude. She hears the details that others flinch from repeating. She records them not because they are comfortable, but because they must be preserved. In a world where so much of Black suffering is erased, documentation itself becomes a form of resistance. Through these years, one case lingers particularly sharply in her mind: the brutal assault of Reese Taylor, a young Black woman attacked by white men in 1944. The men who harmed her walked free, as they almost always did. But in Rosa's careful, determined work, the case does not simply vanish into silence. She helps to gather testimonies, to send letters, to organize petitions. She is no lawyer. She has no powerful title. Yet she is a thread in a network determined to make sure the story travels farther than the men who committed the crime ever expected it to. It is in these moments that Rosa's role in the movement deepens, not through speeches, but through the quiet, relentless work of making sure names are not lost. Each day she comes to the office. She moves with a calm rhythm, arranging papers, sorting through reports, recording every word as if it might one day be needed to prove that what happened was real. And beneath the mundane surface of this labor lies a sharper truth. She is building the bones of a movement. People come into the office with their pain, with their fear, with their stories of how the system bends against them at every turn. Rosa receives these stories with care. She does not rush them. She does not interrupt. She gives them the dignity of being heard fully. Montgomery is a dangerous place for those who push against its order. The office receives threats, sometimes subtle, sometimes not. A passing car that slows too long outside, a letter slipped under the door with no signature, a look held too long in the street. Yet Rosa comes back, day after day, not because she feels safe, but because the work matters more than the fear. Her role is not to stand at the front of a march, not yet. Her role is to be the quiet center where stories gather, where they are named, where they are written down so they can no longer be denied. When the workday ends, the sun often bleeds gold through the thin curtains of the office, painting long shadows across the floor. Rosa tidies the desk, straightens the papers, closes the folders. Outside, Montgomery moves in its divided rhythm, buses passing with their strict lines, people hurrying home, the city breathing in a way that pretends it is unshakable. She locks the door gently behind her, the sound of the key turning echoing softly in the quiet hallway. But the work does not end with the closing of that door. It follows her home, living inside her thoughts, inside the rhythm of her evenings. Raymond understands this world well. Their conversations now flow more easily between the personal and the political, as if the two are no longer separate things at all. The cases she writes about in the office are the lives of people she passes in the streets. They are neighbors, friends, faces she sees in church pews on Sunday mornings. In this world, injustice is not abstract. It has a name, a voice, an address. On certain evenings, when the air cools just slightly and the hum of night creatures begins, Rosa lingers on the porch with her hands folded loosely in her lap. She looks at the dirt road stretching before their house and thinks of the people who have walked down similar roads, carrying the weight of their stories, unsure if anyone will listen. She does not romanticize the work. She knows it is exhausting, that it costs people their jobs, their peace, sometimes their safety. But she also knows something deeper, that silence has always been the weapon of those in power, and that to write something down, to say it out loud, to refuse to let it disappear, is to fight back. The church bells in the distance mark the end of another day. Rosa's shoulders ache from long hours at the desk, but her hands are steady. She breathes in the night air, knowing that tomorrow she will return to that same wooden chair, to the pile of papers waiting to be touched, to the stories waiting to be carried forward. Somewhere beyond Montgomery, a train passes in the dark, its whistle long and low, the sound folding itself into the night like a promise not yet spoken. The whistle of that distant train drifts into the soft hum of a radio, its signal wavering through the thick southern air, a sound that reaches Rosa's ears in the quiet of late evening. It is a time when the world beyond Alabama begins to press its weight more visibly against the narrowness of segregation. The war has ended, and with it comes the uneasy promise of change. Black men have returned from overseas, having worn the uniforms of a country that asked for their loyalty while denying their humanity at home. They return to Montgomery with a sharper clarity in their eyes, carrying the paradox of having fought for freedom in places they were not free to walk in their own towns. Rosa listens to the voices on the radio, to news of shifting tides elsewhere, to speeches, to stories of movements that stir just beyond the reach of the familiar streets she walks. The 1940s are a restless decade. The edges of the world feel closer, pressing against the rigid borders of the South. War industries have created new migrations, drawing people into cities where different languages, different rhythms, different ideas begin to mix. Even in Montgomery, where the lines of segregation are drawn deep and old, the tension is beginning to shift. Rosa senses this not in grand pronouncements, but in the way people speak in lowered voices, in the way they ask different questions at church suppers, in the way some look at the buses not just with resignation, but with something fiercer behind their eyes. Rosa walks through the city as she has always done, head held steady, her steps careful but sure. She sees the men who have returned from the war still forced to step aside, still spoken to as boys, still denied the rights they risked their lives defending. Their frustration hums beneath the surface like a low electric current, not always voiced, but felt. And in the air of Montgomery, the weight of that contradiction begins to gather like summer thunder. At the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People office, the stories that pass through her hands start to change in tone. People are not only telling of injustices, they are asking, with a new kind of urgency, what can be done? There is talk of legal strategies, of collective action, of what it means to push back in a country that promises freedom in its speeches but withholds it in its laws. Rosa continues to listen, to record, to hold the weight of these voices. She is not a loud figure in these meetings, but her presence is constant, unwavering. She is part of the foundation on which larger movements will one day stand. The atmosphere of the time carries both hope and danger. White resistance hardens as black voices grow louder. Laws are not softened, they are enforced with renewed sharpness. Police officers stand at bus stops like quiet reminders of the line between expectation and punishment. In the neighborhoods, people whisper the names of those who have pushed too far and paid the price. Rosa hears those names and carries them with the same care she brings to her work at the office. At night, in her kitchen, she sometimes sits with Raymond, the two of them silent for long stretches. Not because they have nothing to say, but because so much of what needs to be said lives beneath the surface of language. They understand the risk they live with. They have both known it too long for it to surprise them, yet neither speaks of leaving. Their lives are bound to this place, to these people, to the belief that even the hardest soil can crack open under the right pressure. The radio remains on the table beside her, its glow faint, the voices traveling from cities she has never seen but can imagine clearly. New York, Chicago, Detroit, Washington. She hears talk of protests, of court decisions, of debates about equality. She does not romanticize these places. She knows injustice does not end at Montgomery's edge. But she understands something essential. The world is not still. It is moving, and even in a place as rigid as Alabama, movement has a way of seeping in through cracks that cannot be sealed forever. There is a feeling she begins to carry in these years, a feeling not of sudden change, but of slow, deep shifting, like the movement of river water carving stone. She sees it in the faces of students who come to the meetings, in the determined gait of the men who have returned from war, in the quiet bravery of women who keep showing up, even when they are tired, even when they are frightened. Rosa has always believed in the strength of what is quiet, and now she sees it forming around her like something solid. On one particular evening, after the radio goes silent and the house settles into its familiar stillness, Rosa sits on the porch with a glass of water resting in her hand. The air is thick and warm, the stars distant but bright. A car passes down the road, its headlights cutting briefly across her face. She thinks of the men and women she's listened to over the years, of the stories written down in neat, slanting lines in her notebooks, of the countless moments that never make their way into newspapers. She does not yet know the date or the hour that history will place her at its center, but something in her has already accepted that the world cannot remain as it is forever. The night around her seems to hold its breath. Somewhere far away, the whistle of another train slips through the air, long and low, a sound that stretches beyond Montgomery, beyond the borders of what is known. Rosa closes her eyes and listens. The soft whistle fades into the hush of early morning, and Rosa moves through the rooms of her home as the sun begins to rise, touching the walls with a pale, forgiving light. There is something unspoken in the air, something that lives in the quiet routines of her days. She wakes, she prepares herself for work, she steps into a world that demands her compliance at every turn. But inside, beneath the surface of her calm demeanor, there is a weariness that has been building over years. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from lack of sleep, but the deeper, heavier kind that settles in the bones when a person must constantly live beneath the weight of someone else's rules. Segregation is not only a set of laws, it is a daily ritual, a choreography performed without music, rehearsed so many times it seems natural to those who impose it. Every bus ride, every step on a sidewalk, every interaction with a white clerk or officer carries with it the quiet reminder, you are meant to bend, not stand. Rosa bends where she must, because to survive in Alabama is to calculate the risks of every breath. But each small act of endurance leaves a mark. It builds inside her like silt, gathering slowly at the bottom of a riverbed. Unseen, heavy, irreversible. She notices it most at the end of long workdays. She sews at a department store, her hands moving with practiced skill, her back aching from hours at the machine. The job itself is not cruel. It is the world around it that makes it so. The way supervisors speak to her, the way customers look through her, the way the bathrooms are divided by race, as if dignity were a luxury only some could afford. She endures it with a face that gives nothing away, but at night, when she removes her shoes and rubs her tired feet, she feels it pressing down like an invisible hand on her chest. The meetings at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People office continue. She attends them faithfully, records the words faithfully, moves through the same careful steps she has taken for years. But even in that space, one of the few where Black voices are allowed to speak openly, there's a shared fatigue. They have been patient for so long. They have written letters, filed complaints, spoken to officials who turn their faces to stone. Change comes slowly, if at all. And for Rosa, that slowness is beginning to feel less like a delay and more like an intentional silence imposed on an entire people. In church, the sermons still speak of endurance, of faith, of a justice that waits in God's time. Rosa bows her head as others do, but her thoughts wander to something more immediate. She has seen too much to believe that waiting alone will bend the world toward anything resembling justice. The pew beneath her is smooth from years of hands resting against it. How many prayers have been whispered here? How many have gone unanswered? She begins to wonder if prayer, in this place, is less about waiting for something to happen and more about gathering strength to do what must be done when the time finally comes. On the streets of Montgomery, she notices a quiet shift in people's faces, a certain edge in their voices when they talk about the latest humiliation or the latest name whispered about someone hurt or arrested. It is not that people have become louder. It is that the silence has grown heavier, sharper, as if ready to break under its own weight. She recognizes this feeling because she carries it too. There are days she sits alone after work, hands folded in her lap, the late light falling across the floor, and she thinks of how long she's been expected to endure, how long her people have been expected to endure. Endurance has dignity, yes, but it also has limits. She walks past the buses every day on her way to and from work, the same vehicles she has been forced to use since childhood. She knows the rules so well she no longer needs to think about them. Step on at the front to pay, then get off and re-enter through the back door. Never sit in the white section. Stand if a white passenger wants your seat. These rules are not just enforced by the driver, but by the unspoken eyes of everyone on board. They live in the air of Montgomery like humidity, thick and unavoidable. Yet lately, each step she takes on those buses feels heavier, as if each act of compliance were cutting a little more deeply into her. This weariness is not weakness. It is the accumulation of years. It is a kind of exhaustion that precedes decision. She does not speak of it openly to many. She is not a woman who spills her thoughts easily into the world, but in the privacy of her home, she lets herself feel it. Some nights she sits with her hands clasped around a cup of tea that has gone cold, staring out the window at nothing in particular, only listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into its nightly pattern. Rosa has always been patient, always measured, always careful. But beneath that care is a slow, rising certainty that patience has its end. She cannot name the moment yet, cannot say when or how it will come, but she can feel it, like a storm moving just below the horizon line, invisible but undeniable. There will be a moment when her stillness will no longer be enough. There will be a day when the act of rising to give up her seat will feel like a betrayal of something deeper than fear. For now, she carries that weariness like a hidden stone in her pocket, its shape familiar, its weight growing, its edges smoothing with time. On the porch, in the cool of the evening, she closes her eyes and listens. The air is quiet, but beneath the quiet, she can almost hear it. The low hum of a world about to shift. The days that follow unfold as they always have, each one marked by the small repetitions of a life lived inside other people's rules. Rosa wakes, works, walks, rides the bus, listens, endures. The routine is so well worn it almost feels like a script written long before she was born. And yet, beneath the rhythm of these days, something begins to gather, quiet but unshakable, like the first subtle darkening of the sky before a storm. She doesn't speak of it to anyone, not even to Raymond. It isn't something that needs to be spoken yet. It lives inside her chest, in the long breaths she takes on her walks home from work, in the way she watches the buses, not just with tiredness now, but with a slow burning refusal. December arrives with its cool air and its dull winter light. Montgomery is wrapped in its usual routines, the same lines drawn through its streets, the same divided buses moving along their routes as if nothing could ever disrupt their pattern. Rosa's body aches from work, her mind dull from the weight of another long day. She has spent years holding herself upright in this world, carrying dignity like a shield. But that day, Thursday, the 1st of December, 1955, unfolds with no sign that it will be different. It is a day made of small, ordinary motions, sewing, greeting customers, nodding when required, holding her thoughts close. And yet this is the day when the stillness inside her finally meets the weight pressing down upon it. She boards the bus in the late afternoon, as she has done countless times before. The air inside is warm, smelling faintly of gasoline and the mingled scents of people carrying their days home with them. She drops her fare into the box, steps off the bus, walks to the rear door, climbs back inside. She takes a seat in the section designated for black passengers, not at the very back, but in that uneasy middle ground where the rules can shift depending on the driver's mood or the number of white passengers who climb aboard. She places her purse on her lap, her coat folded neatly across her knees, and looks out the window as the bus moves forward. The city slides by, shops, street corners, faces, the same Montgomery she has seen every day of her life. The bus begins to fill. More passengers climb on at each stop, their conversations low, tired, ordinary. And then, somewhere along Cleveland Avenue, the driver speaks. His voice cuts through the quiet like a blade, commanding, practiced, sure of itself. A white man has boarded. The front section is full. The rule is clear. The black passengers in Rosa's row are expected to stand. Not just one seat, but the entire row, so that no white person must sit beside a black person. The command is not a suggestion. It is the daily ritual of humiliation that so many before her have obeyed. The other passengers in the row hesitate only briefly before standing. They know the cost of resistance. They have learned it through bruises, through arrests, through fear that lingers long after the incident itself. Rosa remains seated. She does not make a grand gesture. She does not rise to her feet in protest. She simply stays where she is, her hands folded neatly on her purse, her gaze steady, her breathing quiet. She is not angry in this moment. She is not loud. She is tired in a way that has nothing to do with her body and everything to do with her spirit. The driver turns to look at her. He recognizes her face. She recognizes his. There is history here. He repeats his command. She does not move. The bus becomes silent in that charged, suspended way that silence sometimes does when everyone in a room knows something irreversible is taking place. She feels the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some are frightened for her. Some are indifferent. Some have long since buried their own refusals beneath years of survival. Rosa meets no one's gaze. She does not need to. She knows what she is doing, even if she has not planned it. When she finally speaks, her voice is soft, calm, almost measured. "No," she says. A single word, small and steady, carrying the weight of everything she has endured and everything she will endure after. It is not the sound of defiance in the way people imagine it later, not the roar of revolution. It is quieter than that. But sometimes it is the quietest words that carry the farthest. The driver threatens to have her arrested. She does not stand. The bus remains still for a moment, caught between routine and rupture. Then the driver steps off to call the police. Rosa stays seated. Her pulse beats steadily in her ears, but she does not tremble. She has spent her entire life being asked to move, to step aside, to make herself small. And in this moment, with the winter light fading outside the bus window, she simply chooses not to. The officers arrive. Their presence is immediate, their movements efficient. They order her to stand. She doesn't fight. She doesn't raise her voice. She simply remains who she is, seated, calm, certain. They take her off the bus, the cool air of evening brushing against her skin as they lead her away. The sound of footsteps on pavement, the click of handcuffs, the ordinary city continuing around her as if nothing has happened. But something has. Rosa Parks does not know in that quiet moment of refusal that the photograph they take of her will one day circle the globe, that her name will be spoken in classrooms and churches and courtrooms for generations to come. She does not know that this simple act of staying seated will become a turning point in the long, winding story of a nation. What she does know is that she is tired of giving away her dignity, one small piece at a time. The night air wraps itself around her as she is led into the police car. There are no speeches, no crowds, no flashbulbs, just the sound of the car door closing, the engine turning, and the city moving on. But somewhere beneath the quiet surface of Montgomery, something has cracked. The cold air against Rosa's wrists is a sharp and intimate thing, the kind of cold that reaches the bones without warning. The metal cuffs around her wrists are not tight enough to bruise, but firm enough to remind her of what this city is capable of. She sits in the back of the police car as it pulls away from the curb, her hands steady in her lap, her face turned slightly toward the window. The passing streetlights cut through the darkness in rhythmic flashes, turning the familiar city into something fractured and strange. Montgomery has always been a place of order, a cruel, deliberate order, and now that order is moving around her like a machine designed to humiliate, to break, to remind. But Rosa does not bend, not tonight. They drive her to the station. The walls there are pale and indifferent, the floor hard beneath her feet. The officers speak to one another without really looking at her, their words clipped and casual, the way one speaks when they believe they are acting inside something bigger than themselves, something sanctioned. She answers when she is asked her name, her address, the simple facts they require. Her voice does not shake. There is a part of her, a quiet, deeply rooted part, that has prepared for this moment without knowing it. She is not surprised to find herself here. Perhaps only the precise hour is unexpected. They take her fingerprints. The ink is cold and smells faintly metallic. Her fingers press down, one after the other, onto the smooth paper. It is an intimate act, this recording of identity, meant to strip away the layers of who she is and reduce her to a number, a mark in a book. But Rosa understands something the officers do not. Her name is not a mark on a page. It is part of a long line of names that have endured far worse than this. She is placed in a small cell, a simple, hard space with iron bars, dim light, the echo of other distant sounds moving through the corridors. There is no one else inside. She sits on the narrow bench, her hands folded in her lap just as they were on the bus. The air is cold, but her body is still warm from the adrenaline that lingers like smoke. She is not fearless. She is not numb. But her fear is something quiet, controlled. She has learned, over years of enduring daily humiliations, how to hold fear without letting it consume her. In the stillness of that cell, she begins to understand, not in grand declarations, but in a slow, steady realization that what happened on the bus is no longer just about her. She does not imagine headlines or marches or boycotts, but she knows how stories travel in Montgomery. A single act of defiance does not stay small for long. It travels through church basements, through beauty parlors, through barber shops, through front porches where neighbors lean forward and lower their voices. It finds ears that have been waiting a long time to hear something like it. As the hours pass, she thinks of Raymond. She knows he will come. She also knows he will be afraid, not just for her, but for what this could mean for both of them. Their lives are stitched carefully together with the kind of caution required to survive in a city where black resistance is punished swiftly. She thinks of her mother, of her grandparents, of the fields and the train whistles from her childhood, of all the quiet moments that led her here. Not a sudden, explosive act of rebellion, but the slow gathering of a refusal too large to contain any longer. Word spreads quickly through Montgomery that Rosa Parks has been arrested. People whisper it in hallways and churchyards. By the time Raymond and friends from the local National Association for the Advancement of Colored People arrive to post bail, her name has already begun to move through the community, like a spark rolling toward dry grass. The officers release her with the mechanical indifference of men who believe they have restored order. She steps outside into the cool night, the scent of pine and car exhaust mingling in the air. Raymond takes her hand gently, not asking questions immediately, because he knows there is nothing fragile in her to be soothed. She is steady. Back at home, they sit together in silence. The house feels different now, not because it has changed, but because everything outside of it has. Rosa removes her coat and folds it over the back of a chair with deliberate care, the way she does with everything. She sits down at the kitchen table. Raymond sits across from her. There are no grand speeches, no declarations of destiny. There is only a shared understanding between them. What happened cannot be undone, and the world will not be the same because of it. The following day, the news of her arrest moves through Montgomery like a pulse, steady and sure. Her friends in the NAACP begin to talk quickly, deliberately. They have been waiting, not for her specifically, but for a moment that could galvanize, unite, awaken something buried beneath years of exhaustion. They talk of organizing, of action, of a boycott. The idea had been spoken of before, always with the weight of risk heavy in the air. But now, Rosa's arrest has given that idea a face, a story, a center. Rosa watches all of this with quiet clarity. She does not see herself as a symbol. Not yet. She is simply a woman who refused to give up her seat. But the community sees something in her steadiness, her dignity, her impeccable reputation, the way she embodies the everyday woman forced to live within an unjust system. Her quiet act has become something larger than her, and she understands this with the same calmness with which she sat on the bus. Night falls again. The city outside continues with its routines, unaware of the tremors gathering beneath its surface. Rosa lies in bed, eyes open, listening to the low sounds of Montgomery breathing. She does not feel victorious. She feels aware. Something has shifted. Not loudly, not yet, but in that same quiet way. Rivers shape stone. The world has taken its first step toward meeting her refusal. The night gives way to a pale morning, and Montgomery stirs as it always has, unaware at first that something invisible has already begun to move beneath its surface. Rosa wakes early, her body still heavy with the echo of the previous night, though she has slept little. The house is quiet except for the slow ticking of the clock and the sound of distant traffic on Cleveland Avenue. The world outside looks unchanged, the same buses running their routes, the same sidewalks shaped by old laws, the same winter light falling in thin bands through the curtains. But something has cracked open, and though it makes no sound, the break is real. The people who heard about her arrest have already begun to talk. In beauty parlors, in church basements, on back porches, where neighbors lean in close, Rosa's name is spoken softly but with a growing current beneath it. It is not simply the fact that she was arrested. Arrests happen often in Montgomery to those who dare to resist. It is who she is. A woman known to be steady, dignified, hardworking, unassuming. Not a troublemaker in the way the city likes to label those who dare to stand up. A seamstress, a churchgoer, a quiet presence in her community. Her refusal is not seen as provocation. It is seen as truth. Leaders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People begin to gather that morning. They have long spoken of testing the city's bus segregation laws, of mounting a legal challenge, of organizing the community in a way that goes beyond whispers. There have been arrests before, brave acts of defiance that came and went, but Rosa's arrest feels different. The air around it holds a clarity, a sense that the moment is right in a way it rarely is. They speak in measured voices, aware of the risk that comes with such a decision. To act would mean confronting a system designed to crush dissent. To remain still would mean letting the moment slip away. Meanwhile, Rosa moves through her morning with her characteristic calm. She answers the phone when it rings, receives visitors at her door, listens as people offer their words of encouragement, their plans, their questions. She does not see herself as the leader of anything. She has never sought to be the face of a movement. She has simply lived her life with a quiet resolve that now, unexpectedly, has found itself at the center of history. The weight of that is real, but it does not crush her. She moves as she always has, steady, precise, grounded. As the day unfolds, meetings are held at churches and homes across Montgomery. Flyers are written, printed, folded by hand, passed quietly from person to person. The idea is simple but bold. A one-day boycott of the city's buses. Just one day. A day of collective refusal to participate in a system that humiliates and dehumanizes them daily. If the boycott is successful, it might open the door to something larger. If it fails, there will be consequences, lost jobs, arrests, violence. But for the first time in a long time, the air feels charged with a sense of shared purpose rather than only shared pain. Rosa listens to the plans as they come together. She does not give orders. She is not on a stage. She sits in the same modest rooms she has always sat in, surrounded by familiar faces, voices she trusts. She understands, perhaps better than most, that movements are not born from a single act, but from the convergence of many quiet lives, all carrying the same wound. Her refusal was one spark, but sparks need dry fields to catch. And Montgomery, after years of exhaustion, humiliation, and whispered resistance, is dry enough to burn. That Sunday, the churches are full. The boycott is announced from pulpits, folded into sermons, spoken in the rhythm of prayers and hymns. The church has always been more than a house of worship in Black communities. It is a place where people gather strength, where ideas take form, where movements are born beneath stained glass and worn pews. The ministers speak of dignity, of God's justice, of the quiet power of a people united. No one knows yet how far this will go, but there is a murmur in the congregation that feels different this time. It feels like something alive. On the morning of December 5th, the day of Rosa's trial, Montgomery wakes to a quiet the city has not known before. The buses move along their routes, but their seats are empty. At stop after stop, there are no crowds of Black workers, no lines stretching down the sidewalks. Instead, people walk, miles, sometimes more than an hour, to reach their jobs, their schools, their errands. Others share rides in cars, piling in with neighbors and friends. It is a quiet refusal, disciplined and organized, and it ripples through the city with undeniable force. The drivers notice, the police notice, white citizens notice. The streets carry the sound of footsteps where the rumble of crowded buses used to be. Rosa stands before the court that day, composed, her posture straight, her gaze forward. She is found guilty of violating the city's segregation ordinance, fined $10 plus court costs. It is an expected verdict in a system that was never built to grant justice to someone like her. But the outcome is no longer about her alone. Outside, the boycott is already proving something much larger, that a community can choose, collectively, to withhold its participation in injustice. That night at Holt Street Baptist Church, thousands gather. The sanctuary overflows with men and women who have spent their lives being told that their voices do not matter. Now they are packed together, standing shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same charged air. Rosa sits quietly among them as a young preacher, newly arrived in Montgomery, steps forward to speak. Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice carries through the church, steady and powerful, not yet the thunder that will shake the nation, but already something remarkable. He speaks of unity, of justice, of dignity. He speaks of nonviolence, of the strength in refusing to accept humiliation any longer. Rosa listens. She is not on the pulpit. She is not giving a speech. She is simply there, the quiet center of the story that has begun to unfold. She feels the energy in the room, the way people shift as if standing taller, the way their silence becomes something solid rather than something imposed. She understands that the moment now belongs to everyone in that church, to everyone walking miles along Montgomery streets, to everyone who has ever been told to move and has dreamed of a day when they wouldn't have to. The night air outside Holt Street is cool and still. The sound of singing drifts out into the streets, rising and falling like a tide. Rosa steps out into the dark, the crowd spilling around her, and for the first time, she senses fully what her quiet act has set in motion. The world has tilted, not loudly, not violently, but irreversibly. The nights that follow carry a different kind of silence through Montgomery, not the quiet of resignation that has hung over the city for generations, but the quiet of endurance. A silence threaded through with the sound of footsteps on cold pavement. People walk to work before the sun rises, their shoes striking the ground in rhythmic patterns, a living heartbeat that echoes down streets where buses now glide half empty. It is a kind of defiance that does not shout but speaks all the same. Rosa watches this unfold with a steady gaze, moving through her own days with a kind of deliberate calm. She has never been a woman who seeks attention, and yet her refusal has become the center of a movement that is growing larger with each passing hour. The boycott spreads through the Black community with extraordinary discipline. It is not chaos, nor is it aimless anger. It is something far more difficult: collective organization. Carpool systems are formed overnight. Men with old trucks offer rides to neighbors. Women walk for miles in their church clothes, heads held high, refusing the humiliation of the bus seats they once were forced to surrender. Ministers, activists, and ordinary citizens spend long nights planning, speaking, writing, persuading. The power of this movement is not in one person's act alone, but in the way thousands choose to act together, day after day, against a system built to crush individual resistance. Rosa returns to work, though the air in the department store is different now. People glance at her, some with quiet admiration, others with something harder to read. The city's white establishment watches her too, with narrowed eyes. To them, she is not simply a woman who refused a seat. She is the embodiment of a disturbance they did not expect, a ripple that is now threatening to become a wave. Pressure begins to build around her. The police watch more closely. She receives calls at odd hours, some anonymous, some openly hostile. But she remains steady. She has never believed courage is the absence of fear. She has always understood it to be the decision to move forward even when fear is present. In the evenings, she attends meetings at churches and community halls, though she rarely takes the microphone. Others speak loudly. Ministers, young leaders, men like Martin Luther King Jr., whose voice is beginning to shape something larger than Montgomery. Rosa listens. She takes in their words, their resolve, their uncertainty too. What moves her most is not the speeches, though some of them are stirring. It is the faces in the crowd, faces of ordinary people, worn by labor, marked by years of quiet endurance, now lit with something she has not seen in a long time: a shared fire, a sense of standing up together in a way that once seemed impossible. The white authorities respond, as they always have, with threats and legal maneuvers meant to crush the boycott before it can take root. They arrest drivers offering carpools, fine them for anything they can invent, try to portray the movement as unlawful, dangerous. Some participants lose their jobs, some are harassed on the streets. But the boycott does not falter. It deepens, it hardens. It becomes not only a refusal to ride, but a declaration of self-worth, of dignity too long withheld. Rosa's role remains quiet but unshakable. She attends strategy meetings with Montgomery Improvement Association, listens to lawyers, signs papers, answers questions from journalists who now come knocking. She is photographed, her image traveling beyond Alabama for the first time. Newspapers describing her as a seamstress, a quiet woman, a symbol of dignity. The labels are simple. Almost too simple, but she lets them pass. She understands that movements are built on symbols, but she also knows that behind every symbol, there is a living person carrying the weight of their own private life. At home, the phone continues to ring, sometimes with words meant to frighten. She has learned to hang up quietly and let the silence swallow the venom. Raymond, steady as ever, sits with her at the kitchen table at night. They do not need to speak of fear. It is there between them, understood, acknowledged without ceremony. He supports her not as a public figure, but as the woman he has walked beside for years, the woman whose strength has always lived beneath the surface. Winter deepens. The mornings grow colder. Still, people walk. It is this steady persistence, that begins to unsettle those in power. The mayor, the bus company, the police, they believed the boycott would be brief, a flash of anger that would fade beneath the weight of hardship. But it does not fade. It grows. Every step taken by a black worker walking miles to and from work is a small declaration. We will not return to the back of the bus. Rosa walks too. sometimes alone, sometimes beside others, her coat pulled tightly around her against the chill. People greet her softly, respectfully as she passes. They do not need to say much. The simple act of walking together is a language all its own. She knows some of them are struggling. The distances are long. The risks are real. But she also sees something she has never seen so vividly before, a community moving in unison. It is beautiful in its quiet power. In March, as the boycott stretches beyond what anyone expected, the courts agree to hear the case challenging Montgomery's bus segregation laws. Lawyers, among them Fred Gray, still young and steady in his determination, build their argument carefully. The case is not filed in Rosa's name, but in the names of several others, strategically chosen to strengthen the legal fight. Rosa understands. She has never demanded the spotlight. Her act was never meant for glory. It was meant for dignity. And yet, even as the legal battle unfolds, the movement is more than a court case. It is a living thing now, held together by thousands of small acts of refusal. Every footstep on Montgomery's cracked sidewalks is a beat in its rhythm. Every quiet decision to walk past an idling bus driver staring out of an empty front section is a verse in its song. One night, months after the boycott begins, Rosa stands again on her porch, her breath clouding faintly in the cool air. The streets are dark, but she can hear, faintly, the sound of someone walking, a late worker, making their way home. That sound, soft and steady, is more powerful than any speech. It is the sound of a people who have decided, finally, that they will no longer move aside. The boycott stretches on, far beyond the expectations of those who thought it would collapse beneath the weight of time. Weeks become months, and Montgomery becomes a city, suspended in a new kind of tension. Every morning, the buses rattle down their routes half empty, their drivers glancing through the windows at streets alive with footsteps. The sound of walking has become the heartbeat of the city, steady, patient, and relentless. White officials frown at the empty seats, the bus company loses money, and the local papers begin to speak of trouble, though trouble has been here all along. It is only now that they are forced to see it. Rosa watches the world shift around her with a quiet that belies the magnitude of what she is witnessing. The boycott has grown beyond any single person's control, even beyond the hands of those who helped shape its beginnings. It belongs now to the people who walk each day, to the women carrying children in their arms as they march down cold streets, to the men who polish their shoes in the dark before dawn so they can make it to work with dignity. Rosa is not at the center of the movement in the loud, visible sense. She is one of the many threads woven through its fabric. And yet, her name carries through the city like a signal, soft but persistent, reminding everyone of the quiet refusal that set this tide in motion. But endurance has its cost. The city strikes back. Lawsuits multiply, harassment increases, jobs are threatened, families are watched. Rosa is not spared. At the department store where she works, the unspoken hostility grows colder. The air around her shifts. Whispers follow her down aisles. Customers who once greeted her with practiced politeness now avert their eyes. Management finds reasons to make her life difficult. It isn't a single clean strike of injustice, but rather the slow tightening of a vice. By the spring of 1956, Rosa loses her job. The boycott has made her a symbol, but symbols do not pay rent. She walks home that day with the same measured stride she has always carried, but inside there is a quiet weight. Not regret, never regret, but the heaviness of sacrifice settling deeper into her bones. Raymond faces pressures too. His work at the barber shop grows uncertain as customers, wary of association, drift away. Their home becomes quieter, but not in the way it once was. It is a tense quiet now, layered with exhaustion and the awareness that being the face of Defiance comes with a price. Rosa has never sought to be famous, and fame, such as it is, feels like a shadow, an outline cast by something larger than herself. At night, when the phone rings with threats, Raymond answers, his voice calm but firm. They have learned not to show fear to those who feed on it. And yet, through the hardship, something remarkable persists. Support pours in from the community. Food appears on their doorstep, left anonymously. Neighbors offer quiet words of strength. Church members press envelopes with small donations into her hands. Strangers write letters from other cities, their words steady and reverent. They do not know her personally, but they recognize in her a reflection of their own buried refusals, their own quiet anger. Rosa reads these letters at night, her fingers tracing the handwritten words slowly. She is not someone who cries easily, but there are moments when the sheer magnitude of shared courage presses against her chest until it is difficult to breathe. The white power structure of Montgomery tries new tactics. They arrest carpool drivers on false charges, impose new regulations, attempt to divide the leadership of the boycott. The police grow bolder, pulling over vehicles, harassing walkers, spreading fear. But the people do not break. The sight of thousands walking together has already rewritten something in their collective spirit. They have felt their own strength, and once that happens, returning to quiet submission becomes harder than enduring hardship. Rosa continues to appear at meetings, always quiet, always listening. She watches as Martin Luther King Jr. grows into his role with the grace of someone who understands both the weight of expectation and the danger it brings. She admires his courage, but also knows this movement is not one man's story. It belongs to the people who do not have microphones in front of them. It belongs to the mothers who walk before sunrise, to the maids who take side streets to avoid harassment, to the men who polish their worn shoes again and again. Rosa has never needed a stage to understand power. She sees it walking beside her every day. Her financial situation worsens as the months drag on. Bills pile on the kitchen table. Some nights she sits there long after Raymond has gone to bed, tracing the edges of envelopes as if feeling their weight might make their contents easier to bear. She is tired, and the world does not grant rest easily to those who defy it. Yet even in that tiredness, there is no trace of surrender. She remembers that December afternoon vividly, not as an act of heroism, but as a decision she could not have made otherwise. It was simply the point at which she could no longer give more of herself away. When threats grow more frequent and work becomes scarce, Rosa begins to understand something she had always known in the back of her mind, that standing, or in her case, sitting, against injustice is rarely without personal cost. The city's intention is not just to punish, but to isolate her, to remind her that resistance carries a price few can afford. But what they do not see is that she is not alone. She's part of something larger now, something that cannot be pushed back into silence so easily. On one late evening, Rosa steps outside after another long day of walking, meetings, and counting bills. The air is warm and still. The sound of distant footsteps drifts through the night, the same sound she has come to love more than any speech or headline. It is the sound of ordinary people refusing to bend. She stands on her porch and listens, allowing the night to settle around her. The price she has paid is real, but so is the movement she has helped shape, an invisible force stronger than the men who try to frighten her. She understands something else, too, something few will say aloud. The struggle is not just against buses and seating arrangements. It is against the very architecture of how the world has been built, against a quiet cruelty that stretches far beyond Montgomery's borders. The boycott is a beginning, not an end, and beginnings, Rosa knows, are always the hardest. The winter of that first victory never quite softened the edges of Rosa's life, and as the boycott stretched into history, the world around her shifted in ways that were both visible and quiet. In November 1956, when the United States Supreme Court upheld the ruling that segregation on Montgomery buses was unconstitutional, the city trembled with the force of that change. People filled the churches in prayer and song, their voices rising like smoke from the rooftops into the cold air. The buses, once so rigidly divided, became a battleground of silence and stares. White passengers sat stiffly, their faces carved into disapproval. Black passengers stepped onto those same buses with quiet dignity, their movements deliberate, measured, aware of the weight of history pressing down on every step. For Rosa, however, that legal victory did not translate into an easier life. The boycott had made her name known far beyond Montgomery, but within the city it also made her a target. Victory did not erase the hostility that had shaped her world. It exposed it more plainly. White neighbors who once pretended not to see her now looked at her with open resentment. Threatening letters came more frequently. Raymond's work continued to suffer. Their economic stability, already fragile, began to crumble under the weight of their symbolic role. Rosa had never sought to become a public figure, and fame, as it arrived, was a strange, cold thing. The city itself did not change overnight. The buses might have been legally integrated, but the hatred that had built those walls did not dissolve with a court ruling. Some white drivers refused to move their buses until black passengers stepped off. Others spat slurs under their breath. Some passengers, both black and white, avoided the buses altogether in those first weeks after the ruling, unwilling to sit in that brittle, watchful air. Rosa continued to ride when she needed to, her posture as calm as it had been on the day of her arrest. But she felt it in the stares that lingered too long, in the way certain voices twisted her name like a wound. By the spring of 1957, the weight of that hostility combined with the lack of steady work forced Rosa and Raymond to make a difficult decision. Montgomery had become both the birthplace of something historic and a place increasingly hostile to their survival. They left Alabama for Detroit, carrying with them not a triumphant sense of victory, but the ache of departure that comes when home itself becomes untenable. It was a quiet leaving, without grand speeches or public goodbyes. Rosa walked through the familiar streets of Montgomery one last time before boarding the bus north, her hand tucked into Raymond's, the city receding behind her like a photograph already beginning to fade. Detroit was not Montgomery. It was larger, noisier, layered with a different kind of struggle. The city held the weight of industrial might and migration, a place where black families from the South came seeking jobs and a measure of freedom denied to them below the Mason-Dixon line. But racism did not end at the border. It wore a different face in the North, less codified by law, more insidious, woven into housing policies, employment practices, and unspoken rules. Rosa found herself once again facing the architecture of a society that had been built to contain her people. Only the landscape had changed. She and Raymond moved into a modest apartment. The neighborhood was neither the poorest nor the most prosperous, but it carried with it the same quiet tensions she had always known. Jobs were hard to come by. Their savings dwindled. Rosa's name, now a national symbol of defiance, did not open doors. It often closed them. Some employers did not want the attention that came with hiring her. Others simply did not want her at all. Fame, she learned quickly, could be both armor and weight. Detroit in the late 1950s was alive with the sounds of labor, machines, trains, factory whistles, and yet beneath that industrial rhythm lay familiar wounds. Segregation here was drawn not by law but by mortgage boundaries, redlining, and quiet exclusions. Schools were divided by neighborhoods. Housing was restricted. Jobs were filtered through unspoken hierarchies. Rosa recognized it immediately, the way one recognizes an old injury, even when it comes in a different form. She understood that the North had its own bus seats, its own ways of demanding silence, Still, there were moments of quiet grace. Rosa spent her days helping care for her aging mother, who had moved with them and taking on odd jobs when she could find them. She attended meetings with local activists, listening more than she spoke, observing the rhythms of a new city's struggle. Detroit had its own organizers, its own fights for fair housing, education, and employment. Rosa did not arrive seeking a spotlight. She arrived to live, to work, to continue the quiet fight that had always defined her. The letters continued to come, some filled with words of gratitude, others with threats that stretched like long shadows from the South. She kept the kind letters carefully folded, tucked into a small wooden box she carried from home to home. When she opened them on difficult nights, their words felt like distant lanterns, glowing softly against the weight of disappointment. On certain evenings, Rosa walked the streets of Detroit alone, wrapped in her coat, breathing in the unfamiliar northern air. It was colder than Montgomery's, sharper, and it stung her cheeks. But in that sharpness, she also felt something she had not felt in a long time, a certain distance from the place where everything began. She did not run from history, but she understood now that history often leaves its makers behind, stranded between the myth of their moment and the ordinary weight of their lives after it. She was no longer simply the woman who had refused to give up her seat. She was a woman beginning again in a city that did not yet know what to make of her. She thought often of Montgomery, not with regret, but with the steady, layered feeling one has when looking at a wound that is healed but still aches in the cold. She thought of the buses, of the sound of footsteps, of the night air on the evening she was arrested. She knew that the world had changed, but she also knew it had not changed enough. And as the city of Detroit unfolded around her, vast and restless, she felt something old stirring inside her again, not a moment of decision, but the slow, patient rhythm of a woman who understands that a single act of defiance is only the beginning of a lifetime of struggle. Detroit wraps itself around Rosa like a vast, uneasy silence. It is a different kind of South, one that does not announce its boundaries with signs or ordinances, but places them invisibly into the shape of neighborhoods, the lines of schools, the architecture of daily life. In Montgomery, racism had worn its face in the open. Here, it lurks in the hidden spaces between opportunity and denial. Rosa recognizes its presence not in shouted commands, but in quiet rejections, in polite refusals, in the way doors close softly, one after another. This city offers no warm welcome, but it does offer movement, a sense of possibility carried like wind through its industrial arteries. Raymond finds work eventually, though it is neither steady nor easy. Rosa, despite her name being known across the country, moves through these years with the weight of economic uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. The irony is not lost on her. She is called a hero in public spaces, invited to events and meetings where her story is praised, even celebrated. But when the gatherings end, she returns home to unpaid bills and the cold of an apartment heated only sparingly through harsh Michigan winters. Heroism, she realizes, does not pay the rent. The world may applaud her courage, but it does not sustain her. Detroit in the late 1950s and early 1960s is a city swelling with contradictions. Black workers arrive in steady waves, seeking the promise of jobs and dignity denied to them in the South. The factories, loud and relentless, consume their labor but rarely offer them equal footing. Unions exist, but racial barriers thread through their ranks. Police patrol the city with the same suspicion that Rosa has known her entire life. The buses here have no designated white and black sections, but the boundaries are still felt, quiet and firm. Rosa walks through this world with the same deliberate grace she always has, moving carefully, seeing clearly. She does not rush into leadership in Detroit. She never has been a woman who seeks the stage. Instead, she listens. She attends meetings held in modest halls and church basements, where voices rise not in anger, but in tired, measured truth. The struggle is different here, more layered, more complicated, but it is no less urgent. Black families are being locked out of certain neighborhoods through discriminatory housing practices, their children sent to inferior schools, their work undervalued. Rosa listens to the young activists speak, their voices bright and restless, filled with a kind of fire she recognizes in herself from years past. She sits quietly at the back of the room, hands folded in her lap, and when they ask her to speak, she does so softly, reminding them that change is a river that cuts through stone, not through thunder, but through persistence. Her health falters at times, as does Raymond's, both of them carrying the weariness of years spent pushing against a world that never intended to yield easily. Yet Rosa's spirit does not dull. If anything, it becomes more precise, less romantic, clearer. She has lived long enough to see how victories can be celebrated loudly and lived quietly, how movements that once depended on your courage can move forward without looking back. She does not resent this. It is the nature of history to turn people into symbols and leave the rest of their lives in the margins. She understands that, but she will not be erased. It is in these years living quietly in Detroit that Rosa becomes deeply involved in grassroots work once again. Not the grand marches of national headlines, but the patient, often unseen labor of local resistance. She works on housing issues, joining committees that fight against redlining and neighborhood discrimination. She listens to families who are turned away from homes they can afford, their applications mysteriously denied. She learns the language of Northern segregation, how it dresses itself in legalism rather than open cruelty, how it pretends to be fair while starving people of opportunity. She recognizes that this quiet, calculated injustice can be just as dangerous as the visible kind. She also joins efforts to register voters, understanding that the right to vote, hard-won in the South, is often a hollow promise in cities where power finds subtler ways to keep it from being effective. She does not tire of the small work. She has always known that the soul of a movement lives not in its loudest moments, but in its quiet persistence. Each meeting she attends, each family she helps, each speech she gives to a small, crowded room, these are her new acts of defiance. There are moments of reflection that come to her alone at night. Sometimes she sits in her chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the distant hum of Detroit's factories. The air carries the faint smell of smoke and industry. She thinks of Montgomery, not as a wound now, but as a root, deep and unshakable. She thinks of that bus, of the sound of the driver's voice, of her own steady refusal. People often speak of that day as if it were a single act of courage. She knows it was not. It was the culmination of a lifetime of standing up inside herself long before she stood up in public. Raymond grows older beside her, the two of them bound not just by love, but by the shared experience of being marked by history. They laugh sometimes at the absurdity of being recognized on the street by strangers who know her name but not her life. They hold each other in the quiet, knowing that what the world sees and what they have lived are never quite the same thing. Fame, if it can be called that, is a distant and brittle thing. Their love, their endurance, is solid. One night, as snow begins to fall softly against the city streets, Rosa looks out the window and watches the flakes gather on the ledges. The sound of the wind is gentle, the city muffled beneath winter's quiet. She knows now that her story will never truly belong to her alone. It will belong to classrooms, to speeches, to history books that may soften its edges and tidy its truths. But as long as she breathes, she can live the fullness of it. Not the symbol, but the woman. She will not allow the world to remember only the seat she would not give up. She will remind it through every quiet act that follows that the fight against injustice is not a single moment, but a life. There is a particular stillness that settles over Rosa's life in the 1960s, not the kind born of peace, but the kind that follows a storm, a period where the world seems to move forward loudly, while the one who helped open its door stands quietly to the side. The civil rights movement surges in the South, led by younger, louder voices. Marches sweep across television screens. Speeches are delivered to roaring crowds. The name Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a pillar of a growing struggle, and Rosa watches it all unfold from the modest apartment she shares with Raymond in Detroit. Her name is still spoken in reverence, printed in newspapers, invoked in speeches, but the invitations are fewer, the spotlight narrower, as if the world has placed her in the past tense while history rushes forward. Her health begins to waver during this time. Years of long hours, financial strain, and the weight of living under constant threat leave their quiet marks. She's not yet old, but she feels the heaviness of time more sharply than before. Detroit continues to change around her, expanding and hardening. Factories still hum, drawing in laborers from across the country. But the city is tightening, its neighborhoods more divided, its tension more palpable. The North has its own battles, different from Montgomery but cut from the same fabric of inequality. Rosa, ever the quiet observer, senses the friction growing beneath the city's surface, long before it erupts into the streets. Her activism never stops, though the world often fails to notice it. She takes a job as a secretary and receptionist for John Conyers, a young congressman who sees in her not just a symbol, but a living force of conviction. For years, she works in his office, answering phones, listening to constituents, supporting legislative work. It is not glamorous work, and it does not make headlines, but it places her back inside the machinery of political struggle, a place where she can help in quiet ways. She is known there not as a celebrity, but as Mrs. Parks, steady and kind, a grounding presence. The country convulses through the 1960s. Selma, Birmingham, Washington, Memphis, places that become landmarks in a movement that is at once expanding and fracturing. Rosa listens to the radio, watches television, and hears her own name woven into the fabric of speeches given by others. She feels both close to and distant from it all, like someone standing at the edge of a river they helped dig, watching the current move farther than they can see. Her refusal in 1955 is still remembered, but it is remembered as an opening chapter, not as an ongoing story. She lives inside the space between public reverence and private struggle. In 1965, when the march from Selma to Montgomery takes place, she returns briefly to Alabama to stand alongside those continuing the fight. The air there is heavy with memory. She walks on familiar streets, hears the voices of those who have never left, and feels the weight of her own history pressing gently against her. She is not the woman on the bus anymore, but she is still Rosa Parks. People recognize her face, reach out to touch her hand, whisper their gratitude. She accepts their words with grace, but she knows gratitude does not erase hardship. When she returns to Detroit, the same unpaid bills await her, the same quiet apartment, the same day-to-day struggles that have accompanied her since that December evening. In 1967, the city that has held her for a decade erupts. The 1967 Detroit riot tears through the summer air with fire and fury. For 5 long days, smoke curls over neighborhoods like a dark banner. Tanks roll down streets where she once walked. Sirens wail deep into the night. Rosa watches the chaos unfold not from the distance of a news broadcast, but from the city itself. She understands the anger that explodes into the open. She has seen it building for years, in the quiet discrimination of landlords, in the quiet dismissals of employers, in the quiet brutality of police officers who move through black neighborhoods with heavy hands. This riot is not a surprise. It is the inevitable crack in a dam that has held too much for too long. She walks the streets afterward and sees the scars left behind, burned-out buildings, shattered windows. The air still smells faintly of smoke, as if the city itself has been singed by its own rage. Reporters and politicians speak of disorder, but Rosa knows what they call disorder is often simply the language of people who have been ignored for too long. She does not condone the destruction, but she understands it with a clarity that cannot be softened by easy answers. As the years continue, Rosa moves deeper into work around housing and police brutality. These are not the glamorous front lines of the civil rights movement. They are not marches with cameras or speeches delivered to packed auditoriums. They are meetings held in church basements, in small rooms with weak lighting, where people bring their pain in hushed voices and ask for help. Rosa listens. She takes notes. She connects them to lawyers, to advocates, to anyone who might make their suffering visible. She knows this work is harder to celebrate, but it is no less vital. She sees herself not as someone forgotten by the movement, but as someone doing the work others do not see. Raymond stands beside her through it all. Their lives have grown simpler over the years, their world narrowed by modest means, but their love remains unbroken. They have learned to live in the margins of history, in the quiet spaces where movements either survive or wither. Rosa does not envy those who stand in the spotlight. She knows how easily the light burns. Some nights she sits at her kitchen table long after midnight, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional echo of a siren. She thinks of Montgomery then, not the city as it is remembered, but the city as it was, its dusty streets, its buses, its quiet menace. She thinks of the day she refused to move and how simple the moment felt in its unfolding. She had not been trying to be brave. She had simply been tired of bending. That single decision had grown into something far larger than her. And yet, as she sits there decades later, she understands something deeply. Movements change, history shifts, but the roots of injustice remain stubborn. The country around her celebrates the civil rights victories with annual commemorations. But Rosa sees the reality that remains. Housing segregation persists. Poverty deepens. Police brutality continues. The dream has not yet been fulfilled, only reframed, but she does not despair. She has never been a woman who lives on illusion. She believes in work, not work for glory, but work for change. Quiet work, relentless work. The years roll forward, and the weight of memory begins to shape the way people speak her name. Rosa hears it more often in the mouths of strangers than she ever did when the moment itself unfolded. They call her the mother of the civil rights movement, a title she never asked for and would never have chosen. It is a crown carved from a single December evening, placed on her head without her consent. And though it is spoken with reverence, it also reduces her to something smaller, simpler, a figure on a bus, a face in a textbook, a story that begins and ends with one act. Rosa knows that what they call history is often a version smoothed of its edges, polished until its complications are lost. She does not resent their reverence, but she recognizes it for what it is, a way the world simplifies women like her, so it does not have to face the full weight of what they've lived. She moves through the 1970s with quiet resolve. Raymond's health weakens, and her own body carries the marks of time, the stiffness in her joints, the weariness that has long since become a familiar companion. She attends commemorations of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, sits in front rows as ministers and politicians speak of her bravery, their voices warm and elevated, as if speaking of someone long gone. They describe the event with sweeping language, calling it a turning point, a spark, a moment of national awakening. Rosa sits listening, her hands folded in her lap, knowing that the truth was not as simple as their words. It was not clean or easy. It was long walks in the cold. It was fear and doubt and bills that didn't get paid. It was the faces of people who never appeared in newspapers, who carried the movement on sore feet and tired shoulders. The media often tries to draw her back into that one night, to ask her again and again how it felt to say no. She answers patiently because she understands their hunger for neat stories. But inside, she's aware of how much is left unsaid. She knows that refusing to stand up on that bus was not the beginning of her story, nor was it its end. It was a single thread woven into a far greater fabric. In Detroit, the city around her continues to shift. Economic decline deepens. Factories close. White flight carves neighborhoods apart. Poverty hardens into something colder, sharper. Rosa watches as the struggles she once thought might ease instead take on new forms. Housing discrimination persists. Police brutality grows more entrenched. Injustice is not fading, it is adapting. And she adapts too, in the way she always has, by remaining present, by refusing to look away, by continuing to work quietly where few are watching. She participates in campaigns to support families facing eviction, speaks out against police killings, joins gatherings of young activists who look to her with the kind of reverence that is both humbling and heavy. She's not one to tell young people what to do. Instead, she listens. She listens as they talk about their own fights, their own strategies, their own frustrations with the slow and unyielding nature of change. And when she does speak, she speaks plainly. She tells them that the fight for dignity has never been simple, that movements are not made of heroes alone, but of countless ordinary lives. She reminds them that the quiet work between the headlines is what shapes the world most deeply. There is a certain irony she has learned to live with. Politicians and public figures who once would not have stood beside her now seek her presence at their events. Her name has become a tool, a way to borrow the gravity of history. She smiles when she needs to. She accepts awards with grace. She sits through speeches that flatten her into something neat. But when she returns home, it is still to the same modest space, the same familiar furniture, the same quiet that has followed her since Montgomery. She has learned that the world often celebrates its symbols while ignoring the people living in their shadows. When Raymond Parks dies in 1977, the quiet in their home becomes a different kind of silence. It is not simply the absence of a voice or a body. It is the absence of the one who has shared the long weight of a life lived under the gaze of history. He had been with her through everything. The nights when the phone rang with threats, the days when they walked together through uncertain streets, the years when they were barely holding on. His presence had been a steady anchor, and when he is gone, she feels the shift inside her, like a house settling after a storm. She mourns not only the man, but the shared knowing, the unspoken understanding that only he carried with her. The public, of course, mourns her as an icon, not as a widow, but she does not correct them. She carries her grief in private, as she has carried so much of her life. She continues to appear at events, to sit in chairs set aside for honored guests, to nod as others speak of her legacy in words that never quite touch the living truth. But at night, when the lights go out, she sits alone at her table, hands resting on wood, worn smooth with years, and allows herself to simply feel the weight of being Rosa Parks, not the symbol, but the woman. The world around her celebrates progress, but she has lived long enough to know progress is never as solid as people want to believe. The battles shift, the faces change, but the underlying struggle for dignity and equality is not a story with a clean ending. She watches the news and sees new injustices, different in shape, but familiar in spirit. She is not bitter, but she is honest with herself. Change is a river that never stops cutting through stone. Sometimes it is swift, but most often it is slow, wearing away at the world with the patience of centuries. And still she continues to move forward, not because she expects to see the world transformed in her lifetime, but because she has never believed in standing still. She is, above all else, a woman who endures, not through noise, but through quiet, deliberate persistence. The 1980s arrive with their own peculiar light, a mix of celebration and forgetting, of public gestures that honor a past while quietly stepping around the present. Rosa watches as her name grows larger in the national imagination, becoming a kind of shorthand for bravery, a symbol that can be evoked in speeches without ever unsettling the present order too deeply. She receives more invitations now: universities, political gatherings, commemorative events. People rise to their feet to applaud her before she has even spoken. They speak of her refusal to stand as though it were a single, perfect act that began and ended on a December bus. They speak with reverence, but also with a detachment that she feels like a cold draft in the room. When Rosa does speak, she speaks softly. She's never been one for theatrics or grandstanding. She tells the truth plainly, that her act was not spontaneous heroism, but the result of years of quiet resistance, of exhaustion, of conviction. She reminds audiences that the Montgomery Bus Boycott was not hers alone, but the work of thousands whose names will never appear in textbooks. Some listen with careful attention. Others prefer the simpler story they came to hear. But she does not adjust her words to make them comfortable. She has lived too long, endured too much, to become a decoration in someone else's story. Detroit itself is changing in ways that deepen the fissures she has seen growing for years. Factories close, jobs disappear, poverty spreads through the neighborhoods like winter frost, silent and devastating. The promise that once drew families north begins to fade, leaving behind a landscape of boarded-up buildings and hollowed dreams. Rosa, now aging, walks through the city with the same measured steps she has always carried, seeing its decline with an unflinching eye. She recognizes this, too, as a kind of injustice, quieter than the bus driver's command, but just as cruel. The people who had fled Southern segregation for Northern opportunity now face a different kind of abandonment. She continues to work with housing organizations, supporting families facing eviction, standing alongside them in hearings where their voices might otherwise vanish. Her presence, even silent, has weight. She is Rosa Parks, after all, but she is also the woman who knows what it means to be pushed to the edges, to be made invisible once the headlines move on. In those cramped hearing rooms, her name is not a symbol of history, but a living act of solidarity. She attends meetings, listens carefully, offers what she can. It is unglamorous work, but it has always been this kind of work that keeps the current of resistance alive. Her finances remain precarious. Fame does not fill a pantry or pay a heating bill in the bitter Michigan winters. There are years in which she lives quietly at the edge of poverty, her modest apartment growing colder as the temperature drops outside. Friends and allies step in when they can. Local organizations offer support, but the country that venerates her name does not extend the same generosity to her daily life. This, she thinks sometimes in the quiet of the night, is the nature of how history treats its people. It remembers the act, but forgets the human being who carried it. And yet she refuses to retreat entirely from public life. When Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday becomes a national holiday in 1986, Rosa attends commemorations with a quiet dignity that reminds those around her of the depth beneath the pageantry. She listens to speeches, hears her friend's name carried like a torch through the air. She remembers him not as the towering figure history has made of him, but as the young minister with a clear voice and eyes full of determined fire on those first nights of the boycott. She remembers how fragile and uncertain those early days were. History remembers the March on Washington. Rosa remembers long nights in church basements, the sound of whispered plans, the fear that clung to the edges of their courage. The public begins to see her as a living monument. She senses it in the way people approach her, not as they would approach a woman, but as though they are standing before a statue. They speak to her in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. She smiles gently, accepting their reverence, but it is a strange thing to be venerated while still alive. She has lived through so many years of invisibility that the weight of being turned into a symbol feels almost unreal. There are moments when she retreats into her own silence. In her small apartment, surrounded by the few possessions she has kept across decades, she allows herself to simply be Rosa, the daughter, the wife, the seamstress, the woman who once walked home from school in the dust of segregated roads. She thinks often of her grandparents' porch in Pine Level, of her grandfather standing guard at night with his rifle across his knees. She thinks of the girl she was, sitting under the stars, listening to the sound of the train whistles. She could not have known then how far that sound would follow her, how her life would become entangled with the story of a nation. Some evenings, as she prepares for another public appearance, she pauses before the mirror. The woman staring back is older now, her hair silver, her face marked with lines that hold the years of endurance. She does not flinch from those lines. They are not the marks of fragility, but of a life that has refused to disappear. And when she steps out the door into the public light, she walks with the same quiet strength she carried that day on the bus. She knows that history may have simplified her, but she has not simplified herself. The last years of Rosa's life unfold not in the blinding light of the spotlight, but in a softer, slower glow, the kind that belongs to a person who has already shaped the world and now moves through it like a quiet echo. The 1990s arrive with their own new rhythms, faster, louder, more polished. The civil rights movement has become history to many, a chapter to be studied rather than a struggle still being lived. Rosa feels that distance keenly. She watches as younger generations recite her name in classrooms, their voices uncertain, their eyes not fully able to grasp that the woman on the page is still alive, still rising each morning, still walking down the same modest streets of Detroit. She is not a figure trapped in sepia. She is still breathing, still working, still watching. There is an ache in her body now that never quite leaves her. Age has crept into her bones, slowly but firmly, like water, finding every crack in stone. She walks with greater care, speaks more softly, tires more easily. Yet her mind remains sharp, alert, alive to the world's shifting patterns. She sees how America looks at its history, how it celebrates what is easy to remember and forgets what is harder to face. She sees herself turned into a symbol of quiet courage, a gentle grandmotherly figure, as if her act had not been dangerous, as if her refusal had not been met with handcuffs, hatred, and the cold certainty of jail. They have made her soft in their remembering, she thinks sometimes. They have sanded down the hard edges of her defiance until it fits neatly into a story children can memorize. But she knows what that December evening truly felt like. It was not warm. It was not easy. It was not inevitable. Still, the world continues to honor her. In 1996, she receives the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 1999, she is awarded the United States Congress's Gold Medal. She stands on stages she never imagined standing on, surrounded by political figures and cameras that try to capture her image as though it can tell the whole story. These moments are strange to her. They feel both distant and near, like watching someone else's life play out from the corner of a quiet room. She accepts each honor with grace, her hands steady, her smile soft, but inside she is remembering not medals, but footsteps, not handshakes, but the creak of bus steps under her shoes. She is remembering how cold the night was when the police took her in. She is remembering the weight of silence in the cell, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat as she chose not to move. Her health becomes more fragile as the decade draws to its end. She spends more time in the quiet of her apartment, a space filled with small tokens from a life that has spanned nearly a century. Photographs, folded letters, worn books, the soft hum of a radio in the background. People still come to visit, some out of reverence, some to listen to her stories, some simply to be in the presence of someone whose act helped shape a movement. She receives school children, young activists, politicians, old friends. She speaks with them gently, without pretension. She has never been one for grand speeches. She tells them the truth plainly, the same way she has always lived it, that one person can make a difference. Yes, but only because they are part of something larger. She reminds them that she was not alone. She never was. The power was never just in her seat. It was in the thousands of others who stood or walked beside her. The world around her changes rapidly. Technology accelerates. Cities reshape themselves. New wars rise and fall. She watches these things with the quiet of someone who has lived through so many cycles of hope and disillusionment that nothing startles her anymore. She sees new injustices, some familiar, some freshly born. She sees communities still struggling for dignity, still fighting against the shape of a system that bends slowly, reluctantly, if at all. She does not grow bitter. She understands too well that the river of change is long. She has walked its banks for most of her life. The quiet moments grow longer, and she begins to spend more time with the memories that live inside her. She thinks of Raymond often, of their early years together, of the way their home had been filled with whispered plans and unspoken courage. She thinks of her grandparents in Pine Level, of the fireflies in the fields, of the distant sound of train whistles that once carried the promise of something beyond the world she knew. She thinks of the Montgomery of her youth, not as the city of statues and memorials it has since become, but as it truly was, dusty, divided, dangerous, and alive with the quiet endurance of her people. She remembers faces that history has long forgotten, the ones who walked, who stood silently beside her, who carried the movement without ever being named. In 2002, she suffers a series of health setbacks. Her public appearances become rarer. Her steps, once so steady, grow slower. Yet even as her body weakens, her presence holds weight. When people see her, they see more than a woman. They see the long shadow of a century's struggle standing before them. But she does not carry herself as an icon. She carries herself as she always has, quietly, with dignity. The end of her life comes softly on an autumn day in 2005. She dies in her home in Detroit at the age of 92, leaving behind a nation that has folded her name into its history, sometimes truthfully, sometimes as a story told too simply. In death, the world honors her more loudly than it ever did in life. Tributes pour in from every corner of the country. Her body lies in honor in the United States Capitol, a recognition shared by few civilians. Thousands file past in silence, their steps echoing through the rotunda, a river of memory moving slowly beneath the dome. Her face appears on television screens, her story retold once again. The girl from Pine Level, the seamstress, the quiet woman on the bus. But what the world cannot fully hold in its ceremonies is the texture of her life, the years of invisible labor, the long winters of financial hardship, the countless acts of listening and working in rooms without cameras, the private strength that outlived the headlines. Rosa Parks leaves behind not only the story of a refusal, but the story of a life shaped by quiet resistance at every turn. She was never just a moment. She was a lifetime. And perhaps this is what makes her legacy so powerful. It is not built on grandeur, but on stillness, not on speeches, but on a single unwavering line drawn against injustice. Long after the last tribute fades, long after her name is inscribed in marble in school books, the echo of her quiet courage remains. It lives in every act of refusal, in every voice that chooses dignity over silence, in every step taken toward justice without promise of reward. Somewhere, deep in the collective memory of a nation, that December bus ride remains, a still point in a turbulent century. Rosa Parks sits calm and steady, refusing to give away what should have been hers all along, her right to exist with dignity. That image endures not because it was perfect, but because it was human. The echo of Rosa Parks's life did not end with her passing. It lingers like a quiet chord struck against the vast surface of history, resonating long after the room falls silent. In the years after 2005, the world continues to shape and reshape her story, folding her name into speeches, books, murals, classrooms, political ceremonies, and the long litany of national remembrance. Her image is reproduced again and again, on posters and textbooks on the walls of museums. It is a still photograph of a woman sitting calmly on a bus, but that single image cannot hold the weight of the life she actually lived. It is clean and contained, unlike the stubborn, unpolished truth from which it was born. And yet that image travels, because the world needs symbols. It needs stillness to remember what noise once tried to bury. When people speak her name now, it is often as an opening note to larger stories about civil rights, as if she is the door through which the rest must be entered. Students learn to say her name alongside Martin Luther King Jr., as if their lives were scripted partners in a single act, though their journeys were far more complex. Rosa Parks is taught as a moment, a beginning, a catalyst. But to those who look deeper, to those who search beyond the neat timeline of American triumph, she stands as something even more enduring, a reminder that revolutions are often made not of explosions, but of small refusals that ripple outward like water meeting stone. The city of Montgomery changes with the decades, its streets lined with plaques and markers, its buses carrying people who may not know the weight of the seats they occupy. The stop on Cleveland Avenue where she boarded that bus is now a site of memory, visited by school groups and travelers who arrive to stand where she once stood. It is quiet there, not unlike the way it must have been on that evening in 1955. The world moves around it, fast and indifferent, but at that stop time seems to gather itself, folding the decades into a single breath. In Detroit, the modest apartment where she lived her final years becomes part of the city's quiet history. Some who walk its streets remember her not as the woman in the photograph, but as the neighbor who lived simply, who carried groceries, who walked with measured steps. There is something profound in that ordinariness, a reminder that her greatness was never born from distance. She was not a figure carved from marble, but a woman who stood inside the world like anyone else, who endured its cruelties and chose, on one day, not to bend any further. Her legacy finds its way into places she could never have imagined in her lifetime. Activists across the world, young and old in different languages, on different streets, invoke her name as they stand or sit in defiance of systems designed to silence them. Her refusal becomes a metaphor not because it was crafted to be one, but because it was real. It was ordinary. It was something that anyone, anywhere could understand in their own bones. The act of saying no is both small and infinite. In the years after her death, statues are raised in her honor, including one in the United States Capitol Statuary Hall, where she stands carved in bronze, her figure poised, her face calm, her body turned forward as if mid-step towards something that still awaits. People stand before that statue and look up, seeing in it both history and a mirror. But a statue, Rosa would have known, is not the person. A statue cannot carry the fatigue in her shoulders that day, the stillness in her breath, the precise weight of the choice she made. It can only hint at it, like a shadow cast on a wall. The generations that follow inherit her story in fragments. Some will recite her name without understanding its full gravity. Others will trace it carefully, uncovering the woman beneath the monument. In classrooms, teachers read the story to children, some of whom will whisper questions. Was she scared? Why did they treat her that way? Why didn't she move? And in those whispered questions, Rosa's legacy lives again, not as a perfected symbol, but as a living tension, something to be felt and wrestled with, something that reminds them that injustice is never abstract. Her name also becomes a touchstone in moments of new resistance. Protesters hold signs with her face on them in cities far removed from Montgomery. In times of unrest, her act is invoked not as a memory of a victory achieved, but as a reminder of a struggle unfinished. Because the truth Rosa always understood remains. The shape of injustice shifts, but it does not disappear. The work of refusal must be carried forward again and again by hands she will never touch, in places she will never see. For those who walk where she once walked, there is a kind of stillness that clings to the air. You can almost imagine her there again. The woman who walked to school down dusty Alabama roads, who sat at a kitchen table late at night folding flyers, who stepped onto a bus one winter evening and refused to give away her seat. She is both present and absent, both singular and infinite. In the end, Rosa Parks' legacy is not only the story of a woman sitting on a bus, it is the story of how ordinary people shape the course of history when they decide that enough is enough. It is the story of how a single choice, born of exhaustion and dignity, can stretch its arms across generations. And it is the story of how, long after the applause fades and the medals tarnish, quiet courage continues to move through the world like a low, steady current, impossible to silence. The image of Rosa remains, her back straight, her eyes forward, her refusal unshaken. And in that image, history does not close. It breathes. It waits. It lives on in every quiet, ordinary moment when someone chooses to say no.